The Helvetii were a Gallic tribe, a tribal confederation occupying most of the Swiss plateau at the time of the contact with the Roman Republic in the 1st century BC. According to Julius Caesar, the Helvetians were divided into 4 subgroups pagi. Of these, Caesar only names the Verbigeni and the Tigurini, while Posidonius mentions the Tigurini and the Tougeni. They feature prominently in the Commentaries on the Gallic War, with the failed migration attempt to southwestern Gaul serving as a catalyst for Caesar's conquest of Gaul. Name: the endonym Helvetii is mostly derived from a Gaulish elu, meaning gain, prosperity, or multitude, cognate with Welsh lw, and Old Irish prefix il, meaning many, or multiple. The second part of the name has sometimes been interpreted as *etus, terrain, grassland, thus interpreting the tribal name as rich in land. The earliest attestation of the name is found in a graffito on a vessel from Mantua, dated to c. 300 BC. The inscription in Etruscan letters reads Eluveriti, which has been interpreted as the Etruscan form of the Celtic Luetios, presumably referring to a man of Helvetan descent living in Mantua. The name of the national personification of Switzerland, Helvetia, and the country's Neo-Latin name, Confederatio Helvetica, are both derived from the name of the Helvetii. The star 51 Pegasi was named Helvetios after them. This was the first main sequence star found to have an exoplanet orbiting it. Tribal organization. Of the 4 Helvetan Pagia sub-tribes, Caesar names only the Verbigeni and the Tigurini, Posidonius the Tigurini and the Tougeni. There has been substantial debate in Swiss historiography on whether the Tougeni may or may not be identified with the Teutons mentioned by Titus Livius. According to Caesar, the territory abandoned by the Helvetii had comprised 400 villages and 12 oppida. His tally of the total population taken from captured Helvetan records written in Greek is 263,000 people, including fighting men, old men, women and children. However, the figures are generally dismissed as too high by modern scholars. Like many other tribes, the Helvetii did not have kings at the time of the clash with Rome, but instead seem to have been governed by a class of noblemen. When Vercingetorix, one of the most prominent and ambitious noblemen, was making plans to establish himself as a king, he faced execution by burning if found guilty. Caesar does not explicitly name the tribal authorities prosecuting the case and gathering men to apprehend Vercingetorix, but he refers to them by the Latin terms civitas and magistratus. History. Earliest historical sources and settlement in his Natural History. Pliny provides a foundation myth for the Celtic settlement of Cisalpine Gaul, in which a Helvetan named Helico plays the role of culture or hero. Helico had worked in Rome as a craftsman and then returned to his home north of the Alps with a dried fig, a grape, and some oil and wine, the desirability of which caused his countrymen to invade northern Italy. The Greek historian Posidonius, whose work is preserved only in fragments by other writers, offers the earliest historical record of the Helvetii. Posidonius described the Helvetians of the late 2nd century BC as rich in gold but peaceful, without giving clear indication to the location of the territory. His reference to gold washing in rivers has been taken as evidence for an early presence of the Helvetii in the Swiss plateau, with the Emma as being one of the gold-yielding rivers mentioned by Posidonius. This interpretation is now generally discarded, as Posidonius's narrative makes it more likely that the country some of the Helvetians left in order to join in the raids of the Teutons, Cimbri, and Ambrons was in fact southern Germany and not Switzerland. That the Helvetians originally lived in southern Germany is confirmed by the Alexandrian geographer Claudius Ptolemaeus, who tells of 7 lambda omicron upsilon eta tau iota omega nu rho eta mu omicron sigma north of the the Rhine. Tacitus knows that the Helvetians once settled in the swath between Rhine, Main, and the Hercynian forest. The abandonment of this northern territory is now usually placed in the late 2nd century BC, around the time of the first Germanic incursions into the Roman world, when the Tigurini and Teutonoi are mentioned as participants in the great raids. At the later Vicus Turcum, probably in the first century BC or even much earlier, the Celts settled at the Lindenhof Oppidum. In 1890, so-called potten lumps were found, whose largest weights 59.2 kilograms at the prehistoric pile-dwelling settlement Alpenquai in Zurich, Switzerland. The pieces consist of a large number of fused Celtic coins, which are mixed with charcoal remnants. Some of the 18,000 coins originate from the eastern Gaul, others are of the Zurich type that were assigned to the local Helvetii, which date to around 100 BC. The find is so far unique, and the scientific research assumes that the melting down of the lump was not completed. Therefore the aim was to form cultic offerings. The site of the find was at the time at least 50 meters from the lake shore, and probably 1 meter to 3 meters deep in the water. There's also an island sanctuary of the Helvetii in connection with the settlement at the preceding Oppidiu at Liburg on the former Grosse Hafner Island, as well as the settlement Kleiner Hafner at the Sechslauten Square on the effluence of the Limit on Zurich sea lake shore. First contact with the Romans. The Germanic tribes of the Cimbri and Ambrones probably reached southern Germany around the year 111 BC, where they were joined by the Tigurini, and, probably the Teutonoi. The tribes began a joint invasion of Gaul, including the Roman Provincia Narbonensis, which led to the Tigurini's victory over a Roman army under L. Cassius Longinus near Agendicum in 107 BC, in which the consul was killed. According to Caesar, the captured Roman soldiers were ordered to pass through under a yoke set up by the triumphant Gauls, a dishonor that called for both public as well as private vengeance. Caesar is the only narrative source for this episode, as the corresponding books of Livius' histories are only preserved in the Periodicee, short summarizing lists of contents, in which hostages given by the Romans, but no yoke, are mentioned. In 105 BC, the Allies defeated another Roman army near Arezzo, and went on to harry Spain, Gaul, Noricum, and northern Italy. They split up in two groups in 103 BC, with the Teutons and Ambrones marching on a western route through the Provincia and the Cimbri and Tigurini crossing the eastern Alps, while the Teutons and Ambrones were slaughtered in 102 BC by Gaius Marius. The Cimbri and the Tigurini wintered in the Paddan plain. The following year, Marius virtually destroyed the Cimbri in the Battle of Vercelli. The Tigurini, who had planned on following the Cimbri, turned back over the Alps with the booty and joined those of the Helvetians who had not participated in the raids. Caesar and the Helvetan campaign of 58 BC prelude. The Helvetii were the first Gallic tribe of the campaign to be confronted by Caesar. He narrates the events of the conflict in the opening sections of Commentaries de Bello Gallico. Due to the political nature of the Commentaries, Caesar's purpose in publicizing his own achievements may have distorted the significance of events and the motives of those who participated. The nobleman Augetrix is presented as the instigator of a new Helvetan migration, in which the entire tribe was to leave the territory and, according to Caesar, to establish a supremacy over all of Gaul. This exodus was planned over 3 years, in the course of which Augetrix conspired with 2 noblemen from neighboring tribes, Casticus of the Sequani and Dumnorix of the Aedui, that each should accomplish a coup d'etat in his own country, after which the 3 new kings would collaborate. When word of his aspirations to make himself king reached the Helvetii, Augetrix was summoned to stand trial. facing execution on the pyre should he be found guilty. For the time being, he averted a verdict by arriving at the hearing set for him with 10,000 followers and bondsmen, yet before the large force mustered by the authorities could apprehend him, he died under unexplained circumstances. The Helvetii believed by his own hand. Nevertheless, the Helvetii did not give up the planned emigration, but burned the homes in 58 BC. They were joined by a number of tribal groups from neighboring regions: the Raurici, the Latobridgi, the Tulingi, and a group of Boii who had besieged Norea. They abandoned the homes completely with the intention of settling among the Santones. The easiest route would take them through the Rhone Valley, and thus through the Roman Provincia Narbonensis. Battle of the Seiwan. When they reached the boundaries of the Allobroges, the northernmost tribe of the Provincia, they found that Caesar had already dismantled the bridge of Geneva to stop their advance. The Helvetians sent the most illustrious men of the state to negotiate, promising a peaceful passage through the Provincia. Caesar stalled them by asking for some time for consideration, which he used to assemble reinforcements and to fortify the southern banks of the Rhone. When the embassy returned on the agreed-upon date, he was strong enough to bluntly reject their offer. The Helvetii now chose the more difficult northern route through the Sequani territory, which traversed the Jura Mountains via a very narrow pass at the site of the modern Fort Lyriclus, but bypassed the Provincia. After ravaging the lands of the Aedui tribe, who called upon Caesar to help them, they began the crossing of the Seiwan, which took them several days. As only a quarter of the forces were left on the eastern banks, Caesar attacked and routed them. According to Caesar, those killed had been the Tigurini, on whom he had now taken revenge in the name of the Republic and his family. After the battle, the Romans quickly bridged the river, thereby prompting the Helvetii to once again send an embassy, this time led by Divico, another figure whom Caesar linked to the ignominious defeat of 107 BC by calling him Bello Cassio Dux Helvetiorum. What Divico had to offer was almost a surrender, namely to have the Helvetii settle wherever Caesar wished them to, although it was combined with the threat of an open battle if Caesar should refuse. Caesar demanded hostages to be given to him and reparations to the Aedui and Allobroges. Divico responded by saying that they were accustomed to receive, not to give hostages, a fact the Roman people could testify to, this once again being an allusion to the giving of hostages by the defeated Romans at Agon. Battle of Bibliography. In the cavalry battle that followed, the Helvetii prevailed over Caesar's Aedui allies under Dumnorix's command, and continued the journey, while Caesar's army was being detained by delays in his grain supplies, caused by the Aedui on the instigations of Dumnorix, who had married Augeteric's daughter. A few days later, however, near the Aeduan Oppidum Bibliography, Caesar caught up with the Helvetii and faced them in a major battle, which ended in the Helveti's retreat and the capture of most of the baggage by the Romans. Leaving the largest part of the supplies behind, the Helvetii covered around 60 kilometers in 4 days, eventually reaching the lands of the Lingons. Caesar did not pursue them until 3 days after the battle, while still sending messengers to the Lingons warning them not to assist the Helvetii in any way. The Helvetii then offered their immediate surrender and agreed both to providing hostages and to giving up the weapons the next day. In the course of the night, 6,000 of the Verbigeni fled from the camp out of fear of being massacred once they were defenseless. Caesar sent riders after them and ordered those who were brought back to be counted as enemies, which probably meant being sold into slavery. Return of the migrants. In order for them to defend the Rhine frontier against the Germans, he then allowed the Helvetii, Tigurini and Latobrigi to return to the territories and to rebuild the homes, instructing the Allobroges to supply them with a sufficient supply of grain. Caesar does not mention the Raurici, who seem to have built a new oppidum at Basel Munsterhügel upon the return. The Aedui were granted the wish that the Boii who had accompanied the Helvetii would settle on their own territory as allies in the oppidum. The nature of Caesar's arrangement with the Helvetii and the other tribes is not further specified by the consul himself, but in his speech pro Balbo of 56 BC, Cicero mentions the Helvetii as one among several tribes of foederati, i.e. allied nations who were neither citizens of the Republic nor her subjects, but obliged by treaty to support the Romans with a certain number of fighting men. Caesar's report of the numbers, according to the Victor tablets with lists in Greek characters, were found at the Helvetan camp, listing in detail all men able to bear arms with the names and giving a total number for the women, children and elderly who accompanied them. The numbers added up to a total of 263,000 Helvetii, 36,000 Tigurini, 14,000 Latobrigi, 23,000 Raurici, and 32,000 Boii, all in all 368,000 heads, 92,000 of whom were warriors. A census of those who had returned to the homes listed 110,000 survivors, which meant that only about 30% of the emigrants had survived the war. Caesar's report has been partly confirmed by excavations near Geneva and Bibliography. However, much of his account has not yet been corroborated by archaeology, whilst his narrative must in wide parts be considered as by his stand, in some points, unlikely. For a start, only one out of the 15 Celtic oppida in the Helvetii territory so far has yielded evidence for destruction by fire. Many other sites, for example the sanctuary at Mormont, do not exhibit any signs of damage for the period in question, and Celtic life continued seemingly undisturbed for the rest of the 1st century BC up to the beginning of the Roman era, with an accent rather on an increase in prosperity than on a Helvetic twilight. With the honorable status as foederati taken into account, it is hard to believe that the Helvetii ever sustained casualties quite as heavy as those given by the Roman military leader. In general, numbers written down by ancient military authors have to be taken as gross exaggerations. What Caesar claims to have been 368,000 people is estimated by other sources to be rather around 300,000, or 200,000. In the light of a critical analysis, even these numbers seem far too high. Verbigeni considers an army of more than 60,000 fighting men extremely unlikely in the view of the tactics described, and assumes the actual numbers to have been around 40,000 warriors out of a total of 160,000 emigrants. Delbruck suggests an even lower number of 100,000 people, out of which only 16,000 were fighters, which would make the Celtic force about half the size of the Roman body of c. 30,000 men. The real numbers will never be determined exactly. Caesar's specifications can at least be doubted by looking at the size of the baggage train that an exodus of 368,000 people would have required. Even for the reduced numbers that Verbigeni uses for his calculations, the baggage train would have stretched for at least 40 kilometers, perhaps even as far as 100 kilometers. In spite of the now much more balanced numerical weight we have to assume for the two opposing armies. The battle seems far less glorious a victory than Caesar presented it to be. The main body of the Helvetii withdrew from the battle at nightfall, abandoning, as it seemed, most of the wagons, which they had drawn up into a wagon fort. They retreated northwards in a forced night march and reached the territory of the Lingons 4 days after the battle. What Caesar implies to have been a desperate flight without stopping could actually have been an ordered retreat of moderate speed, covering less than 40 kilometers a day. Caesar himself does not appear as a triumphant victor in turn, being unable to pursue the Helvetii for 3 days, both on account of the wounds of the soldiers and the burial of the slain. However, it is clear that Caesar's warning to the Lingons not to supply his enemies was quite enough to make the Helvetii leaders once again offer peace. On what terms this peace was made is debatable, but is said before the conclusion of Odes casts some doubt on the totality of the defeat. Questions of motive. As Caesar's account is heavily influenced by his political agenda, it is difficult to determine the actual motive of the Helvetii movement of 58 BC. One might see the movement in the light of a Celtic retreat from areas which were later to become Germanic. It can be debated whether they ever had plans to settle in the Saintonge, as Caesar claims. It was certainly in the latter's personal interest to emphasize any kind of parallel between the traumatic experience of the Cimbrian and Teutonic incursions and the alleged threat that the Helvetii were to the Roman world. The Tigurini's part in the destruction of L. Cassius Longinus and his army was a welcome pretext to engage in an offensive war in Gaul whose proceeds permitted Caesar not only to fulfill his obligations to the numerous creditors he owed money to, but also to further strengthen his position within the late Republic. In this sense, even the character of Divico, who makes his appearance in the Commentary half a century after his victory over L. Cassius Longinus, seems more like another hackneyed argument stressing Caesar's justification to attack than like an actual historical figure. That the victor of Vegan was still alive in 58 BC, or, if yes, that he was physically still capable of undertaking such a journey at all, seems more than doubtful. Nevertheless, Divico became somewhat of a hero within the Swiss national feeling of the 19th century and in the course of the Geistige Landesverteidigung of the 20th century. The Helvetii as Roman subjects. The Helvetii and Rauraci most likely lost the status as foederati only 6 years after the Battle of Bibliography, when they supported Vercingetorix in 52 BC with 8,000 and 2,000 men, respectively. Sometime between 50 and 45 BC, the Romans founded the Colonia Alulia Equestris at the site of the Helvetan settlement Novia Dunim, and around 44 BC the Colonia Raurica on Rauricam territory. These colonies were probably established as a means of controlling the two most important military access routes between the Helvetan territory and the rest of Gaul, blocking the passage through the Rhone Valley and Sundgau. In the course of Augustus's reign, Roman dominance became more concrete. Some of the traditional Celtic oppida were now used as legionary garrisons, such as Vandanissa or Basilia. Others were relocated, such as the hill fort on the Bois de Châtel, whose inhabitants founded the new capital of the Civitas at nearby Aventicum, first incorporated into the Roman province of Gallia Belgica, later into the Germania Superior, and finally into the Diocletian province of Maximus Sequinorum. The former territories of the Helvetii and their inhabitants were as thoroughly Romanized as the rest of Gaul. The rising of 68–69 AD, what seems to have been the last action of the Helvetii as a tribal entity, happened shortly after the death of Emperor Nero in 68 AD. Like the other Gallic tribes, the Helvetii were organized as a civitas. They even retained the traditional grouping into 4 pagi and enjoyed a certain inner autonomy, including the defense of certain strongholds by their own troops. In the civil war which followed Nero's death, the civitas Helvetiorum supported Galba, unaware of his death. They refused to accept the authority of his rival, Vitellius. The Legio 21 Rapax, stationed in Vindonissa and favoring Vitellius, stole the pay of a Helvetan garrison, which prompted the Helvetians to intercept Vitellian messengers and detain a Roman detachment. Aulus Caecina Alienus, a former supporter of Galba who was now at the head of a Vitellian invasion of Italy, launched a massive punitive campaign, crushing the Helvetii under the commander Claudius Severus and routing the remnants of the forces at Mount Facetius, killing and enslaving thousands. The capital of Enticum surrendered, and Julius Alpinus, head of what was now seen as a Helvetan uprising, was executed. In spite of the extensive damage and devastations the civitas had already sustained, according to Tacitus, the Helvetii were only saved from total annihilation owing to the pleas of one Claudius Cossus, a Helvetan envoy to Vitellius, and, as Tacitus puts it, of well-known eloquence, confirmed and assumed Celtic oppida in Switzerland. The distribution of Latin culture burials in Switzerland indicates that the Swiss plateau between Lausanne and Winterthur was relatively densely populated. Settlement centers existed in the Aare Valley between Thun and Bern, and between Lake Zurich and the River Ouse. The valley and the regions around Bellinzona and Lugano also seem to have been well populated. However, those lay outside the Helvetan borders. Almost all the Celtic oppida were built in the vicinity of the larger rivers of the Swiss Midlands. Not all of them existed at the same time. For most of them, we do not have any idea as to what their Celtic names might have been, with 1 or 2 possible exceptions. Where a pre-Roman name is preserved, it is added in brackets. Those marked with an asterisk were most likely occupied by neighboring tribes rather than the Helvetii. Altenburg-Rheinau, Basel asterisk, Bernenger-Hulbensel, Bois de Châtel, Avenches, Eppenberg, Jensburg, Genève asterisk, Lausanne, Martigny asterisk, Montchebauf asterisk, Monterrey asterisk, Montvalley, Sermes, Uetliberg, Zurich, Windisch. Bibliography. Caesar, Julius. Commentaries on the Gallic War. Check date values in date equals. Andres Verbigeni, Die Helvetia, Kulturgeschichte eines Keltenvolks. Neue Zürcher Zeitung, Zurich 1984. ISBN 3-85823-071-5. Alexander Held, Die Helvetia, Verlag Neue Zürcher Zeitung, Zurich 1984. Felix Müller, Genevieve Luscher, Die Kelten in der Schweiz. Theis, Stuttgart 2004. ISBN 3-8062-17599. Felix Sterlen, Die Schweiz in Römische Zeit. 3. Neuberg Anderu. AUFL. Schwabe, Basel 1948. Gerald Walser, Bellum Helveticum, Studien zum Beginn der Caesarischen Eroberung von Gallien. Steiner, Stuttgart 1998. ISBN 3-515-07248-9. SPMIV Eisenzeit, Age-Dufer Eta del Ferro, Basel 1999. ISBN 3-908006-538.